best podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
My discomfort with comfortability.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
Say, would you do something for us? If you enjoy this podcast and you're subscribed to it and you're benefiting from it, would you share it with someone? Just send it to a friend whom you think might enjoy it, might benefit from it. And you could do that easily from most podcast apps. I know you can easily do it from Apple Podcasts. And that would really help us. Personal recommendation is the single best way, the most effective way that people find out about the Heidelcast.
The Heidelcast.
With this episode, we're starting a new series, and we're going to call it Grammar Guerrilla. Guerilla, not Gorilla. A guerrilla is sort of an underground fighter of sorts, I guess. And I've been fighting a sort of underground war in favor of better grammar for a long time. And I thought, maybe I should just do that on the podcast for a bit. Maybe that would encourage people who are trying to figure out how to express themselves more effectively, how to become better writers. And people might want to know what they can read that would help them. And part of why I want to do it is, I had to do it for myself. My education really didn't prepare me to become a very good writer, which was odd because I did a lot of writing. When I was in high school, we had electives, and I took all the English classes they offered, and I wrote a great deal when I was in high school, but I got very little instruction on how to write, and the instruction I got wasn't particularly helpful. People didn't explain grammar very well, frankly, and it remains still something of a mystery. And frankly, it really didn't begin to come together for me. English grammar, didn't begin to come together. I didn't really begin to understand it until I learned Latin. And I think if we brought that back, and if every American public schools student had to take, maybe a semester of Latin, it would really, really help. It transformed my education. Two things actually transformed my education. That was one of them. But before that, I took a logic class. And in that logic class, or at the end of it, before the final, I don't even remember if there was a midterm, but there was a final. And the professor Hughley said, spend 10 hours. So he reduced studying for the final to a finite task. And he said, memorize these formulae by writing them out so you can write them out without looking. So just copy them out over and over again on a chalkboard. That's how long ago this was. And you have to do it by hand, by the way. It doesn't work if you do it on the computer. There are reasons for that. And one of them is we don't relate to the computer the same way we do to a whiteboard and a marker. When you do things by hand, writing them out, that actually engages your brain in a way that typing does not. And I've seen that without any scientific evidence, but just practically, I have seen that for years and years as a teacher. I had students who would take notes on their laptop, which seemed like a good idea. I remember a student doing that before laptops, when there were no laptops. He had a K-Pro computer, kind of in a tin case, as I recall, and he brought that thing into class, and he would set it up at the beginning of the day, and he would tap away during the day, transcribing the lectures more or less. And if you missed class, it was great. We could just go and get a photocopy of the dot matrix printed notes from that class. And so there were some benefits. But what I found as a teacher is that students who were taking notes on their computers were not really listening. They were not really engaging with the material. They were not thinking about what they were writing down. And when you write by hand, you have to think, well, do I want to write that down? That takes some energy, and you have to listen, and you have to think critically a little bit, and there's more engagement. And there is some research to say that is, in fact, the better way to listen and learn. So I did what he said, got a chalkboard and a piece of chalk, and I wrote out those formulae I don't know. Maybe I did it on paper. I don't really remember now. But I wrote those formulae out over and over and over till I could do them from memory. And I did it for 9.5 hours, and I got tired, and I quit. And I should have spent that last half hour. I think I probably would have done a little better on the test. But when the test came, maybe for the first time in my education, I knew almost everything on the test. I just knew it cold because I had memorized it. And so I knew what he was asking, and I knew what he wanted me to write and what the right answer was. And I did it. And I think I got all the way down to the last question. And I knew the question, at least I was familiar with it. I had seen it, but it was one of those I probably didn't memorize because I didn't spend that last half hour. But in that experience, I realized that this was the secret to education, was memorization. And my whole education to that point had led me to think that memorization was a bad idea because every time to that point, and I was 20 when this happened, every time a teacher used the word memorization, it was always accompanied by the adjective rote. And from the context and the tone of voice, I inferred that rote was a bad thing and then memorization was a bad thing. Because, in fact, a lot of people had become convinced, maybe the 50s, but certainly the 60s and 70s, that memorization was a bad thing and that what we needed to have in school was experiences and not memorization. That's why you had a culture clash in the 1970s when parents were going to public school board meetings and demanding that schools return to reading, writing, and arithmetic because schools had begun to give up on that. And parents didn't have any idea what was going on. And they didn't understand the philosophical shift that was taking place and why their kids weren't learning the things that they should learn. Of course, that was in the 70s. That was long ago. And we've long ago left those kinds of things behind. Parents aren't even going to school boards anymore demanding that the schools teach their children how to read, write, and do math. They're going to school boards now to demand that boys be treated like boys and girls like girls. So that's a whole other series of podcasts. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was I took Latin then after I had learned to memorize, and I was taking Greek at the time, and learning to memorize had begun to transform my Greek learning. And then I applied what I learned in Greek to Latin, and I just memorized stuff. I went to the back of the book. I actually missed first semester Latin. I took second semester, first year Latin, and I just memorized the back of the book, all the vocabulary and the forms, and I went to the classics seminar room, and I just wrote out the stuff I needed to memorize, and I put the vocabulary I needed to memorize on flashcards, and I just drilled myself on flashcards. And you look at the word you're supposed to know, and if you can translate it and say what it is, then you've got it. And if you don't, then you look on the back and you make your stack. You have two stacks: the stuff you know and the stuff you need to work on. And then you just review and drill yourself over and over again. Then I was writing out these forms and stuff and memorizing. That was the key. And those two things really transformed my education.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
In learning Latin, I began to understand how English works. I really had no idea what a subject was, what an object was, what an indirect object was, and in a sense, how possession worked in English. It was only when I learned, Greek really, and then Latin. So I said Latin, but it started with Greek that I began to understand these things, because in Greek and Latin, you have cases that tell you what the subject is and what the object is and what the indirect object is and what the source or noun or adjective of possession is. They have markers that tell you that. And that alerted me to the fact that those categories exist. And from that point forward, I began to really learn. I began to read better, although we'll come back to that. And I began to have a better, clearer idea of how English works. Well, my experience as a teacher now for more than 30 years tells me that things are not getting better in this regard. And so years ago, I began writing posts, articles on the Heidel blog. They started out as little things, and just things that I had noticed that people were doing and things that I had learned about grammar. And what happened was that after seminary, I realized that though I had written a lot in seminary, I didn't think yet I was a very good writer. Since nobody had seen fit to teach me how to write, despite all the classes I had an English minor in college, and all the papers I had written in seminary, my professors were helpful theologically occasionally they were helpful with my grammar, but most of the time they just said nothing. And as a teacher who marks papers, I understand why that was. I'm not criticizing it. It was just a fact. So I sat down and I began to read books about how to write. And one book led to another, and after a while I had read quite a few. So somebody wrote 10 years ago and said, I want to be a better writer. Well, what do I do? What books should I read? And what I said is, here's a quick list of some books that have influenced me over the years. And I should say, caveat, that the list is a little misleading. A lot of what I've learned about reading and writing and grammar is not from reference works or books about style, but simply good literature. I often say, if you want to learn to write, and I'm not presenting myself as a guy who has this all figured out, or even necessarily as a good writer, but as somebody who does a lot of writing, right? And that's all I'm saying here, is to read good writers and read good literature. Now, I enjoy a range of writers in a variety of genres, but if I could just pick out a few, Mark Twain impressed me as being a really good writer. And what makes a good writer? Well, I wanted to keep reading. When I read Twain, I thought, this guy is funny, he's smart, he's interesting, and I want to keep reading him. I feel the same way about P.J. O'Rourke. Every time I read P.J. O'Rourke, I think I need to read more P.J. O'Rourke. I have a stack of P.J. O'Rourke books in my bedroom on a sort of nightstand, waiting for me to get to them. One of my very favorite writers is C.S. Lewis, and yes, the fiction's great, but the stuff I've really enjoyed from Lewis is the nonfiction stuff, his literary criticism. That was his actual professional job, was writing literary criticism. The fiction he wrote was sort of a side gig. His technical work on English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, was brilliant. Maybe one of the finest books I've ever read. I doubt many people know that Lewis wrote that kind of literature, but he did. Dorothy Sayers is a marvelous writer. Whenever I read Dorothy Sayers, I think, okay, I want to keep reading. Right? There's some people I read, for example, famous writers. William F. Buckley. I learned a lot from reading Buckley, but I found it difficult to read it. Now, his fiction was very well written and engaging, but his columns I often found difficult to read, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. E.B. White is somebody that has influenced me. James Thurber. So if you know anything about modern American literature, you'll notice that I have an affinity for that group of writers from the early years of the New Yorker, who were sometimes lumped together as the Algonquin Round Table. So as I say, I consciously began working towards becoming a better writer after seminary. So I started picking up reference books and books on writing in used bookshops, when we used to have used bookshops. And I think the first thing of that sort that I read was Edwin Newman's books, and I'll give you the titles in a minute. I knew Newman from television news, and I remember being struck, even before I knew he was a writer, that he was a well-spoken fellow. So I thought, well, I'll read Edwin Newman. He probably can help me. He was one of those newsmen from the old school who probably had been a newspaper guy, had a background in print journalism like Walter Cronkite, the kind of guy that certainly wouldn't be hired to do the evening news on your local station and probably then would never make it to the network. And after that, I read the volume 1 of Mencken's American Language. I read William Safire. As I say, I read Buckley. As I mentioned, he was hard to read. The Oxford English Dictionary is maybe one of the best tools ever created for users of the English language. I'm able to access it electronically, which I think is far and away the best way to use the Oxford English Dictionary. I can do it electronically through my school where I teach. And you have a chance to use the OED, whether you get the 2-volume micro version where you have to use the magnifying glass or however you're going to use it. I highly recommend it. There are a lot of books about language and about writing. Caught in the Web of Words is one. The Joy of Lex is another. Lynn Truss, Truss. I hope that's the right pronunciation. I've never heard anyone pronounce it. I've never heard her interviewed. She's English, but other than that, I only know her from her books. I use the Chicago Manual of Style. I always buy the latest edition whenever it comes out. There are other works that have helped me, Fowler's English Usage. So go get one of the earlier editions. There's a modern contemporary edition of Fowler that's been revised quite a bit. If you want to have the real experience of Fowler's English Usage, you should get an earlier edition. It's a lot of fun, if only for the way that he insults abusers of the English language. You can learn a lot about English just by randomly reading entries in Fowler's English Usage. Jacques Barzun, again, I don't know how to pronounce that name. I hope that's correct. Barzun, was a prophet about the decline of American education. And as I implied earlier, nobody paid any attention, and here we are. There's some other titles that might help. Willard R. Espy, 1989, The Words Gotten Out has helped a lot of people. I've used Wilson Follett's 1966 Modern American Usage, which, given the date, maybe isn't modern. I guess it's modern in a sense. It's not contemporary. My edition is from 1950. There are other similar works. Garner's Modern American Usage. Then, as I mentioned, Mencken's The American Language. His argument is that we should talk about American as distinct from English. There are a lot of Englishmen who would agree. The Edwin Newman volume, I think, that got me started was his 1974 volume, Strictly Speaking, Will America Be the Death of English? And then he followed that up in 1975 with A Civil Tongue, both published by Bobbs Merrill.
Call or text now 760-618-1563.
Strunk and White, The Elements of Style. It's been out in numerous editions, and I don't know that it matters which one you picked up. William Sapphire's 1991 Coming to Terms is an example of the stuff he's written on language. Lynn Truss wrote a marvelous book, which I strongly recommend, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. It's eats, comma, shoots, and leaves. The zero tolerance approach to punctuation. I wish I had that book when I was in high school. It would have helped me quite a bit. And just as a matter of literature, I mentioned E.B. White. One volume that I've really enjoyed is his 1954 volume, The Points of My Compass, published by Harper and Row. My colleague Dennis Johnson used to use a volume by William K. Zinsser, Zinsser, of 2001, On Writing Well. And that's been around for a long time. It was the 25th anniversary in 2001, so that takes it back to the 1970s. So we'll wrap up this first episode with this, and we'll come back with some more specifics as the series continues. But if you're trying to become a better reader, a better writer, a better user of the English language, let me encourage you, you can do it. But you don't have to stay where you are. You can take small steps every week and work on it a little bit and become a better writer. Get a notebook. I almost always have with me, or most of the time I have with me, some sort of 5x7 or maybe slightly larger notebook. I have a shelf or 3/4 of a shelf, half a shelf of notebooks that I started filling up about 2000 or 2001. I don't remember exactly when it was. And when I fill up a notebook, I start a new one. And I take my notes by hand most of the time, probably 90% of the time. And I write out outlines for things that I'm working on. And I make notes in there. Get yourself one of those notebooks and get a decent fountain pen. I say fountain pens because you will find that it's a lot easier to write with a fountain pen than it is to write with a ballpoint pen, which is really just paste. That's all that is. So those are terrible things with which to write. If you want a roller ball, that's fine. I am frustrated most of the time by those things because they don't work as well as they should. So I write actually most of the time now with a really old fountain pen that a friend of mine reconditioned. It's a Parker 51 is what I use. But I've got a bunch of fountain pens. They're easy to get, and that'd be a whole other series of podcasts. But get a good pen that's comfortable to use. Get a decent notebook. I go to Barnes & Noble, and they have these relatively inexpensive leather-bound notebooks, but there are others. I'm trying one from, I think it might be France. I don't even know how I found out about it. And the paper in it is very nice, very easy to use. And Rhodia, I think it is. Anyway, lots and lots of notebooks out there. And if you want to become a better writer, write a little bit every day. When I help students with their writing, I say, once a week, send me 300 words that you've written about anything. I don't care. and just write 300 words. This is basically one page typewritten. And let me look at it, see what you're doing and how you're doing. So that's one good use for a blog is even if nobody reads it, just to develop the discipline of daily, or at least weekly, writing down something and learning how to put your thoughts in some sort of coherent form. And you can do it. You can become a better reader, a better writer, and a better user of the English language.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast, the Heidelcast.